Okay, next up, it was supposed to be May Berenbaum, that's who's in your agenda, but she unfortunately couldn't join us today, so Dietram Scheufele has stood in for her. Dietram is a professor of science communication at the University of Wisconsin-Madison and the Morgridge Institute for Research. He's also on the steering committee for this conference. As chair of a committee, he served as a chair of a committee that evaluated tenure guidelines in Wisconsin, so he's had an opportunity to influence the incentives to communicate. Dietram?
Thank you. Yeah, so my apologies, first of all, on behalf of May Berenbaum, who had a last-minute conflict and felt really horrible about having to skip this and has been involved in science communication for a long time. May and I had an opportunity a few years ago to co-chair the Public Interfaces in the Life Sciences Roundtable that Keegan Sawyer, who I think is here, was involved with and led. And as part of that roundtable, we had a lot of conversations about tenure guidelines. And I was, at the time, co-chairing, or chairing rather, a committee at Wisconsin to look at a revision of the biological sciences. So this was not in the social sciences, it was not in the humanities, not in the physical, but in the biological sciences, a revision of our tenure guidelines that we're moving toward what we call an integrated case. So an integrated case that combined elements of public outreach, engagement, with traditional tenure criteria, and was explicitly tailored toward looking at a candidate's overall impact on the field, rather than what we traditionally had done, meaning, you need your R01, and if you have that, you're ultimately going to be fine. And all of you, many of you know tenure infrastructures guidelines. They're different at different universities. I only know two very well, Cornell and Wisconsin, because I had tenured positions at both. But they typically involve research, teaching, service in some way, some combination, and typically it requires excellence, at least at Wisconsin, in 2 out of those 3. At Wisconsin, 1 of those has to be research. So that's how the guidelines are written. In recent years, I think we've seen a pushback against that, and I think a very welcome pushback against that at major research universities. That is, though, not completely true, because many land grants have had this for a long time. The idea of extension has come up a couple of times now. And a lot of people at Cornell, at Wisconsin, I'm sure at Rutgers, and all the other land grants all over the country have percentage appointments that partly put them in academic units and partly put them into extension. When they go up for tenure, evaluating their work in working with communities, working with stakeholders, working with community agents and so on becomes a large part of their tenure package. And questions of how to quantify that and how to evaluate the quality of that have plagued, in a good way, tenure committees for a long time. So it's not a new problem. I think it's interesting now that it's beginning to creep into, in a really good way, into the bench sciences, into the social sciences, into sciences that maybe haven't always used that as part of their tenure guidelines. The challenges that we encountered were that people said, well, A, it's unclear then how you distinguish between these two if you have an integrated case. How do you make a distinction between the research that's being done and the impact that has? And are you really counting it towards service and toward research and all these things at the same time? Are you double dipping? Are you double counting? What are the criteria that you're going to be using for excellence? Because that's really the level or the threshold that we hold people to, and more than once have we heard when we talk to various people at the university that we're watering down the standards. But I think there's more than the challenges, there's real opportunities, and both at Urbana-Champaign, where May oversaw an effort that really informed our thinking at Wisconsin as well, is this idea that I think people see a huge opportunity. And we heard the hunger from younger people is totally true. We've seen that as well at Wisconsin. But I think there are 3 things that are really important. One is outcomes. We need to actually be very clear what we mean when we talk about outreach, engagement, communication, public scholarship. And you look, all the documentation at Urbana-Champaign, at Wisconsin, those things are used in very oblique terms. And it's not clear what we mean by them, and I think that's not very helpful when we are trying to write tenure guidelines. As we are talking about incentive systems, we need to do a lot more thinking in that respect, and we have to be very clear. Number 2, one of the things that comes out is transparency. From the beginning, these things need to be established. As a candidate comes in, this is not something that develops over time, But this needs to be acknowledged as people are hired in the very beginning as something that's important for their career, and then over the next 6 years that gets evaluated against those standards that are negotiated between a department chair and a candidate. That's when these cases are really the most successful. And number 3 is evaluation, meaning that these standards for evaluation are agreed on at the very beginning. What is the specific, and the Illinois language says independent, verifiable, and specific evidence of excellence and impact in the area of outreach. I think as we're moving forward, I think there are lots of really good models. At Wisconsin, we now have a PhD, we have for a while, a PhD minor in science communication for bench scientists that's transcriptable, that shows up on their transcript, that trains bench scientists for careers that involve outreach in whatever combination it may be. And I think the statistic that we've heard again and again about younger scientists being excited about that is completely reflected in every survey of scientists that we've ever done from any field, from nanoscience to synthetic biology, that we're seeing a new generation coming up, and that maybe it doesn't just take one funeral, but it really does maybe not even take that, but simply a generational shift. So thank you.
Thank you, Dietram.